I'm really honored to be at this meeting today. And I think that Jose's very great introduction summed up the importance of this meeting very well. We're in a situation now in which we know that the problems that have plagued Flint with the rise of lead and copper in their water system is in Detroit and is going to be coming to Detroit in an even stronger, more powerful way than it already has in terms of what we've seen lead and copper levels in the 19 schools which were tested for lead and copper a few months ago, and then the issue was buried. And there has been no more discussion of it. There hasn't been discussion of the dangers of lead and copper. There hasn't been discussion about what happened to the other schools, what was found in those schools. There hasn't been discussion about what testing has been done in the charter schools. There hasn't been an explanation given for why it is that in some schools there are high levels of lead, sometimes in a water fountain, sometimes in a spigot, in a kitchen sink, sometimes in a bathroom sink. There's been no explanation at all about what is causing this and what can be done to prevent it. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit first about what it is that took place in Flint, why it is that we know that we're on the precipice of what happened in Flint coming to Detroit, and what it is that we can do to stop it now, before we find ourselves drinking brown, copper, and lead-filled water like the people in Flint have had to for the last 2 years. The story of Flint starts with the emergency manager law. It starts with the removal of democratic rights of the people of Flint. And that Detroit has felt already in terms of what's happened with public education. Anywhere that there's been an emergency manager, anywhere where the people have been denied the democratic right to elect their officials to oversee the budgets and spending in their cities, anywhere where there's been an emergency financial manager functioning as a czar, pretending that what he is trying to do is solve a crisis of the budget. Anywhere where that's taken place, disaster has followed. In Detroit, we've seen it in terms of the shutting down of the public education system. But every single crisis caused by a financial manager only leads to another crisis caused by a financial manager. And let me give you an example coming out of Flint. In Detroit, the closure of public schools has led to hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Detroit, leaving Detroit, because as the schools closed down and as the libraries closed down, the neighborhoods started to shrink and close down because people weren't about to send their 5-year-old child or their 7-year-old child to a school that was way far away and that the parents could never have access to. The right to even walk your child to the first day of his or her kindergarten was taken away from so many families in Detroit. And many of those families, rather than face the choice of having to give up on public education or accept charter school education, left the city. And when they left, there were a number of homes that were abandoned. Most of the abandoned homes, I believe, that have been stripped and just trashed. The banks could have stopped that from happening. because that's the other reason people had to leave. They had mortgages that they no longer could afford to pay. And rather than lower the mortgages for those people and make it possible for families to stay in Detroit, the banks squeezed them out until people had to leave the homes that they had fought for so long in their lives to attain. Well, abandoned homes and abandoned neighborhoods is one of the things that contributes to the problem of lead and copper poisoning in a city. Because in Flint, where a similar thing happened and people left the city of Flint, it meant that getting the water from the reservoir, which was turned into the Flint River, into the homes meant that the water had to travel a very long distance, and that oftentimes it stopped and it became still water, and it was sitting there, and as it was sitting there it started to collect bacteria, and as it collected that bacteria it began to create health crises based on that bacteria. In Flint, the first crisis when Flint went to using the Flint River rather than rely on its water from Detroit, which had a world-famous high-quality water system, the first thing that happened, the first sign that something was going to go terribly, terribly wrong, was that there was a bacterial infection that spread throughout Flint caused by something called E. coli. That's a type of infection that is usually associated with waste material being in the water, with no separation between fresh water and soiled water. And that health crisis in Flint, that beginnings in 2014 of a bacterial spread in Flint and people getting very, very, very sick from the dirty water that they were being asked to drink and bathe in and use in their houses to clean. The reaction of the emergency manager and the people who controlled the water in Flint was to put more chlorine into the water. The Flint River is a river that has a lot of chlorine in it already. And if you add more chlorine to a water system in which the pipes are made out of iron and copper and lead, the pipes begin to deteriorate. They deteriorate because the chlorine causes a breakdown in the lead, and the lead starts to enter the water, and the copper starts to enter the water. And so if you're trying to solve the problem of the bacterial infections that you're spreading by killing those, by adding chlorine into the water system, all you're doing is making an existing problem worse. How did this all happen in Flint? The emergency manager in Flint, Darnell Early, who had once been, and thankfully because of the organizing and efforts of BAM, was driven out of Detroit. But before he was driven out of Detroit, and before he tried to destroy public education here, he was the emergency manager over Flint. And he and his fellow emergency managers decided in 2014 that they were going to save money by no longer relying on the city of Detroit to provide the water for the people of Flint. And instead, what they were going to do is try to rehabilitate an old water treatment plant in Flint that was supposed to take water from the Flint River and turn it from dirty water into clean water that could be consumed by human beings. And the reason that they decided to stop using the water from Detroit was because they said they had no money. But the cost of using Detroit water was somewhere around $100 a day. That's water from Detroit to provide drinking water for the people of Flint, $100 a day. That in a city that has many thousands of people, an emergency manager could make the decision that $100 a day more was too much to pay to guarantee clean water to the people of his city. That is a remarkable beginning to this story. So when they decided to rehabilitate this old water treatment plant in Flint, there was a contract that was given to a friend of Darnell Early. And it was a contract for $500,000. And it was a contract, an agreement, that Governor Snyder claimed he didn't know whether it even existed, and he certainly couldn't find it when they were doing the investigations in Flint. But it did come to the surface in the beginning of May. And that contract for $500,000 was supposed to provide Flint with a plan of how to clean up the water from that river so that people could drink it. And what was recommended in that $500,000 plan was nothing that could have solved the problem that Flint was about to face when they switched over to using the water from the river. There was no suggestions made in that plant of how to stop the problem of lead poisoning from happening if the water from the Flint River was used. So they started using the water with no plan, with no idea of how they were going to turn it from dirty water into clean water, from wastewater into clean water, and they just started to use it. That's what the emergency manager thought, and as dictator of the city of Flint, he could get away with. It wasn't until maybe a month at the most when people of Flint started receiving the wastewater from the river that people in Flint began to say, less than a month, something is terribly wrong. This water is brown a lot of the time, and it's heavy. It's like heavy with sediment. And there started to be cases of people coming up with different kinds of ailments. And there were a number of people in Flint that got Legionnaire's disease because the water was so unclean. It was spreading that deadly bacterial disease to the people of Flint. And the people of Flint demanded action. They begged the state for some kind of action. And they turned to a state department that is supposed to guarantee the high quality of the environment. And that department did nothing but start a cover-up. And that cover-up was continued by Snyder, by the mayor of Flint, and by every public official that could have done something to stop this. I said that after this bacterial infection began, then Flint decided to solve the problem on the cheap by throwing a bunch more chlorine into the water system. And I just want to show people this picture. And it can be passed around. But the picture on the top is what the pipes in Flint look like before they started using the water from the river. They were smooth, they weren't full of holes, they were perfectly fine, and they were lead then, just as they're lead now. It's not that they got new pipes when they made this change. And the pipe on the bottom that looks like a diseased animal, and it is a diseased pipe about to create human illness and disease, permanent loss of mental and physical facilities of people in the city of Flint, starting at a very, very young age. The bottom pipe is what the pipes in Flint started to look like a month after the change was made from Detroit to Flint. So just pass that around. And there's another picture going around that shows the erosion in the pipes. And you just look at these pictures of the instant corrosion, of how quickly it happened. And you don't have to be a scientist to look at those pipes and to know that there was a disaster in the making in Flint. Just if you looked at the pipes as a layperson, you could tell that. And still, nothing happened in Flint. Flint has been in this fight for some time. But we in Detroit can save the people of Flint and make it possible for them to dig up those old disease-led pipes and get a water system that they can use, because that is the only answer now in Flint. There's nothing that can be done to make those pipes better now. There are things that can be done to make them bad instead of horrible, but there is nothing that can be done to solve the problem of the water in Flint other than to dig up those pipes and replace them with a whole new water system. Well, the people of Flint, they relied on the powers that be. They relied on lobbying. They relied on speaking at public meetings. They relied on lawyers to try to get them some justice. They relied on their ability to get press coverage for what was going on in Flint to make the fight. And 2 years after Flint, the people of Flint began to be poisoned by lead and copper, there is still no serious effort being made to solve the problem. We're not going to let that happen in Detroit. We're going to fight here. And we're going to fight by the only way that you can fight and win in a situation like this. And that's to build a movement. Because even though Flint is known all across the nation as a scandal, even though Governor Snyder has been in public hearings where he's shown himself to be a liar and somebody who could not care less about the quality of life of the people in Flint, in which if there was any justice, Governor Snyder would be tried as a criminal right now. He would be tried as somebody who has created a human disaster that could have been avoided. He should be tried for the damage that has been done to all of the children and all of the older people of Flint who suffered from lead poisoning. But none of that is happening. And Governor Snyder has managed to stay in office and weather this crisis despite the fact that everybody in the nation now has heard about Flint and has heard about the conditions that exist there. What they haven't heard about, and what we're going to build, and we've started building in Detroit, is the civil rights movement that's needed to actually win. The civil rights movement that's needed to mobilize the people of the city of Detroit and beyond Detroit to make a fight that, for lack of a better way to put it, scares the heck out of our enemies. And if it doesn't scare them into providing the people of Detroit and the people of Flint with the clean water and public education and restoration of democracy that we deserve, if it doesn't scare the heck out of them when we're marching in the streets, when we're holding pickets at schools, when we're organizing churches to come out and march down Woodward as Martin Luther King did in 1963, if that isn't enough to cause the change that we need, then it's time for an uprising. Because sometimes you have to make the fears of your enemy real for them to understand that you mean business. And that's where we're at in Detroit. We're at the beginning of that. I want to just read something because I think it says that there's so many young people here today, and that young people are the key to building this new movement. There was a pamphlet that was put out by the Michigan Health Department speaking to parents about what to do when you found out that your child had lead poisoning. And I'll say something in a minute about the effects of lead poisoning. But what the pamphlet said is, parents, you're going to go through a 4-step process. Here's a picture of it, this 4-step process, and I'll just read it out loud. It says the first thing that you're going to experience when you find out that your kid has lead poisoning is anger. That's the first thing, anger. And sometimes that anger might be directed against yourself, and sometimes it might be directed against your child. And sometimes it might actually be directed against the people who caused your child to be lead poisoned. But after you overcome the anger, and you follow the advice given in this pamphlet, then the next thing you'll feel is guilt. Well, maybe you should have done something. Maybe you should have given your child bottled water, or maybe you should have gone outside and stopped your child from playing in the dirt and in the grass, because in Detroit there's lead in the ground. And if you play in the fields of Detroit and many, many places, you're going to get lead poisoning from the earth itself. Or maybe you should feel guilty because you didn't know that your house still has lead paint in it, which is true for the majority of houses in Detroit. And this is the amount of lead that it takes to get lead poisoning. If your child plays on the floor of a room where there's lead paint, and you try to rub off the walls and clean it, and a little bit of dust falls on the floor, and your child is crawling around, or they're just playing on the floor, and there's a tiny amount of dust, so little that you wouldn't even see it and think that you would have to vacuum it. And if your child touches that and then puts their fingers in their mouth, they're going to get lead poisoned. It doesn't take some astronomical amount to cause lead poisoning in a child. So after you stop feeling guilty for what it is that you're blaming yourself for that caused the lead poisoning, the pamphlet says the next thing you're going to feel is grief. You're going to feel sad for yourself. None of this pamphlet has anything to do with your child. It has to do with the subjective emotions of the parent. So the next thing you're going to feel is grief. And you're going to feel grief because you're going to be like, wow, my child is going to have a learning disability for the rest of their life. My child might join the ranks of those children in Flint that have tried to kill themselves at 6 and 7 years old because of lead poisoning. My child might have kidney failure and be on dialysis from the time that they're a little person on for the rest of their lives because they have lead poisoning. My child may not be able to fight off diseases because they have lead poisoning. Those are the effects of lead poisoning. And if you're one of those parents and you have lead poisoning, because even though you're an adult, it will affect you. If you don't go through this process of coming to the point, you come to one of 2 points to avoid this problem. Either you decide you're going to fight so your blood pressure doesn't go through the roof, because the main effect of lead poisoning in adults is to cause high blood pressure. So you either decide, oh, I'm going to accept this, or you decide, I'm going to fight. And the pamphlet says the 4th stage is acceptance. So you go from anger to guilt, and then you resign yourself and you grieve like you've died and your kids died, and then finally you reach acceptance. Now, that four-step process, anybody who goes to grief counseling after somebody has died, that's what you're going to hear. That is the four-step process that's recommended or advocated for people who've lost someone. Not someone who is preparing themselves to build a new movement to make sure that this doesn't happen to any other child or any other adult, and to make sure that the fight that we're launching actually wins. So that's what parents are told. And in all honesty, that's what we've seen from too many parents. Anger coupled with denial. Anger at themselves, guilt, all of those things. But not the will to go out and build a movement and fight. It's only in the young people. And sometimes in really young people, 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds, that we've seen the will to march and to fight, the desire to build a movement and to do something. And that's not because young people are foolhardy, it's because young people, including children, are capable of the kind of optimism and vision that it takes to build a movement that seems like it's fighting an enemy that is too strong to ever beat. It's the young people who are going to build this movement. And it's the young people who don't have to apologize for why they didn't fight in the past, when the schools were being closed down and the water was deteriorating in the city of Detroit and in Flint. The young people have nothing to apologize for. They did nothing. But too many of the old people feel like they have to apologize for the state of things now. And if you feel like you have to apologize for it, you're blaming yourself for the conditions that you never created. And you're apologizing for the fight that you didn't make. But you can make if your children are prepared to lead and build this movement. That's why the young people have to be in the forefront of it. And it matters. And it's possible for this movement to win. We started organizing in Detroit around the problem of lead and copper when we saw an article that was in the Detroit News that listed a number of schools that had problems of high lead content and copper content in the water. One of the things about the process I described in Flint that is illustrated so well in those pictures of what happens to a pipe when there isn't adequate and correct treatment of the water, that begins not so much on the inside of pipes usually, but it begins with the deterioration and the leaching of lead and copper at the points where there are joints and fixtures, at the point where there's a spigot, at the point where there's something chrome or something brass or something copper that begins to change. And instead of being brass or copper or lead that is coated in a covering to protect the water, it becomes a weapon, because that coating to protect the water is worn down, and once it's gone, then the water with all the chlorine and the rest of the stuff that's in it that is supposed to be solving health problems becomes the water that is breaking down the lead and filling the water supply with lead and copper. But it first starts, the first way you know that there's something wrong with the way that the water is being treated, and the first way you know that there's something to fix is that you start to see high lead levels in a sink or in a drinking fountain. And it's why in Detroit, in so many of the schools, the excuse that's being given by the principals for doing nothing around the lead poisoning in the school is, oh, but it's just one drinking fountain. So we closed off that drinking fountain. But if it's in that drinking fountain, it's going to be in your sink in a little while. And once it gets in your sink, it's going to be in every single pipe that provides water, not just in that school, but the water that flows to that school that also flows to homes and businesses and all of that is going to be contaminated. Detroit was always famous for the quality of its water. And Detroit made a fight to be able to protect that water. And BAM was so proud in 2012 to be part of the strike of people who were fresh and wastewater workers in Detroit to try to stop the busting of their union and to try to stop their jobs from being privatized and eliminated, that were trying to provide through